My parents kicked me out of the house because I just wanted to work in the IT field. When I climbed the career ladder, I bought their house and became their landlord, tripling their rent. It was a Friday night, and like every other Friday night, James sat down with his parents for dinner. The table was set with his mother's favorite china, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the room. James's father, William, a stern man with sharp blue eyes, sat at the head of the table. His mother, Evelyn, who often tried to keep the peace, sat across from James. Despite the calm atmosphere, a knot of tension had been growing in James's stomach all day. He knew what he had to say, but he dreaded how it would unfold. For months, he had struggled with his decision. He had started his college journey as a pre-law major, following in his father's footsteps. His father was a well-known attorney, and it was always assumed James would take over the family firm one day. But the more James studied law, the more he realized his heart wasn't in it. He'd always had a passion for computers, spending countless hours in high school coding and tinkering with technology. A few weeks ago, he finally decided that he couldn't continue down the law path. He had to switch to computer science. He cleared his throat as they passed the mashed potatoes. His mother smiled at him, not knowing what was coming next. "Mom, Dad, there's something I need to talk to you about," James began, his voice trembling slightly. His father looked up from his plate, narrowing his eyes. "What is it, son?" James took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about my major, and I've decided I want to switch to computer science. I know this is a big change, but I've thought it through, and this is what I'm passionate about." For a moment, the only sound was the clinking of cutlery. James watched as his mother's face fell. His father, on the other hand, turned red with anger. "Computer science," his father barked, slamming his fork down onto his plate. "Are you out of your mind, James? We've invested thousands into your education so you can follow in my footsteps, and now you want to throw it all away to play with computers." His mother tried to interject, her voice shaky. "William, maybe we should hear him out." "No, Evelyn," William snapped, cutting her off. "This is nonsense. James, do you have any idea what you're doing? Law is your future. Computer science? That's a hobby, not a career. This is ridiculous." James's hands shook as he clenched them in his lap. "Dad, it's not a hobby. I've thought long and hard about this. I know what I want to do with my life." His father scoffed. "You don't know anything. You're too young to make these decisions. You think you can just change your major and everything will be fine? Do you know how much you're risking? You'll throw away all the opportunities I've lined up for you." His mother's eyes were filled with concern, but she said nothing, glancing nervously between her son and husband. "I'm not asking for permission," James said, his voice firming up. "I've already started the process. I'm changing my major." William's face contorted in rage. "If you walk away from law, you're walking away from this family's future. You won't get a penny from us, not for tuition, not for rent. You're on your own. If you think you're old enough to make your own decisions, then you're old enough to take care of yourself. You have 24 hours to pack your things and get out of this house." Evelyn gasped, tears welling in her eyes. "William, you can't." "I can, and I will," William growled. "James, if you don't want to live by our rules, you don't live under our roof." End of discussion. James's world felt like it was collapsing. He hadn't expected his father's reaction to be this extreme. His mother reached for his hand across the table, but he pulled away. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in. Without another word, James stood up from the table and walked out of the dining room. He could hear his mother calling his name, her voice cracking with emotion, but he didn't turn back. He went straight to his room, slamming the door behind him. James sat on his bed, staring at the wall. The anger in his chest felt like it was burning a hole through him, but behind the anger was fear. Fear of what came next. He had never lived on his own before, and now, with just 24 hours to figure it out, he felt lost. As he started to pack his things into a duffel bag, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his best friend, Noah, asking if he was still up for their weekend plans. James stared at the screen, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on him. Noah had no idea what had just gone down, and James wasn't ready to explain it over text. Suddenly, there was a knock at his door. It was his mother. "James, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let me in." Reluctantly, he opened the door. His mother stepped inside, her eyes red from crying. "I'm so sorry," she said, sitting down on the edge of his bed. "Your father? He can be so stubborn, but he doesn't mean it. He's just disappointed." James looked at her, feeling a surge of bitterness. Disappointed? He just told me to leave. How am I supposed to deal with that? Evelyn reached out, placing her hand on his arm. "James, you don't have to leave. I'll talk to him. Maybe tomorrow, when things have calmed down, we can sit down and discuss this rationally. You know how he gets. He's just worried about your future." James shook his head, his resolve hardening. "No, Mom." He made it clear how he feels. "I need to go. I'll figure it out on my own." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks as she squeezed his hand. "I don't want to lose you." "You're not losing me," James said softly. "But I can't stay here if this is how things are going to be." Evelyn nodded, defeated. "Just promise me you'll be safe. Call me if you need anything." "I will," James replied, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. As Evelyn left the room, James felt a hollow emptiness settle in his chest. The life he had known was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In the morning, James finished packing the last of his things. His father hadn't said another word to him since the argument the night before, and his mother had tried to act like everything was normal, though it was clear she was still heartbroken. James didn't know where he was going to go, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't stay here. As he stood at the front door with his bags in hand, he took one last look at the house he had grown up in. The memories of family dinners, holidays, and childhood moments flooded his mind, but they all felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else's life. With a deep breath, he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. After James left his parents' house, he stood in front of the door for a moment, gripping his bag tightly. He didn't have much, just a few changes of clothes, his laptop, and whatever cash he had saved from odd summer jobs. As the reality of his situation began to sink in, he made the only call he could think of. "Hey, Noah, can I crash at your place for a while?" Noah, always the laid-back one, didn't hesitate. "Sure, man. Come over. We'll figure it out." Noah lived in a small apartment downtown. It was cramped, with barely enough room for Noah's things, let alone a second person's belongings. But it was better than being out on the street. When James arrived, Noah greeted him with a fist bump and helped him bring his few bags inside. "Sorry, it's a bit of a mess," Noah said, clearing pizza boxes from the couch. "You can take the couch or the floor, whatever works." James dropped his bags and collapsed on the couch, exhausted. "Couch is fine. Thanks, man. I owe you." "No worries," Noah said, grabbing 2 beers from the fridge and tossing one to James. "You'll figure this out." But as the days turned into weeks, figuring it out wasn't as easy as Noah made it sound. Living in Noah's small, cluttered apartment was tough. There was no privacy, and James quickly found himself feeling like a burden. He tried to keep up with his classes, but without a stable home, it became increasingly difficult. He'd spend his mornings at the library, studying and trying to focus, but his mind was always elsewhere. How was he going to afford rent? How could he keep up with coursework when he was crashing on someone's couch? James started looking for work, but balancing a job with his college schedule was impossible. At first, he tried waiting tables at a nearby diner in the evenings. The pay was terrible, and the hours were long. By the time he got back to Noah's apartment each night, he was too exhausted to study. His grades began to slip. One night, after a particularly grueling shift at the diner, James returned to the apartment, only to find Noah sprawled out on the couch, surrounded by empty beer cans. "Rough night?" Noah asked, barely lifting his head. "Yeah, something like that," James muttered, tossing his apron onto a chair. He collapsed onto the floor, his head spinning with exhaustion. Noah sighed. "You can't keep doing this, man. It's killing you." James knew he was right, but what other choice did he have? His savings were gone, and the thought of asking his parents for help was out of the question. He was on his own, and dropping out felt like failure. But eventually, he couldn't keep up the charade any longer. His professors noticed his absences, and his assignments piled up. A week later, He made the toughest decision of his life. He dropped out of college. James hadn't imagined that this would be his life. He felt like everything was slipping away from him. His education, his future, his dreams. Without college, he didn't know what to do next. Noah was supportive, but even he couldn't offer more than a place to stay and the occasional advice. "You can't just sit here, man," Noah said one evening as they sat in the dimly lit apartment. "You've got to figure something out. It's not the end of the world that you dropped out. Plenty of people make it without a degree." "Yeah," James said, though he didn't feel reassured. "But what do I do? The only thing I know is programming." "Then keep doing that," Noah replied. "But you've got bills to pay too. Maybe get a night job or something and work on your coding during the day. I've got a friend who's working security at this place downtown. They're looking for more people." It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. James called Noah's friend, Mark, and got the security gig almost immediately. It wasn't much, mostly sitting in a dim lobby overnight, watching monitors, and making rounds. The pay was better than the diner, and the hours gave James time to focus on his programming during the day. But it was lonely work, and more often than not, James found himself staring at the dark hallways, thinking about everything he had lost. The worst part was the fatigue. Working nights meant his days were shorter and more fragmented. He'd grab a few hours of sleep in the morning, wake up, and immediately dive into coding. His projects started small, building websites for local businesses, writing simple scripts for automation. But even as his skills grew, so did his exhaustion. One night, as he sat in the security office, his phone buzzed. It was an email from a small startup that had seen one of his projects online. They wanted to talk. James's heart raced as he read the email over and over, barely believing it was real. Was this his chance? He set up a call for the next day and spent the rest of his shift pacing the halls, his mind racing with possibilities. But when the call finally came, it wasn't what he had hoped. The company liked his work, but they weren't ready to hire. They wanted more experience, more projects, more everything. James hung up, feeling the weight of the rejection settle over him. He stared at his computer screen for what felt like hours. Was this all he was going to be? A night security guard who coded in his free time, hoping for a break that might never come? The next few months passed in a blur. James picked up more shifts at the security job, sometimes working double nights just to make ends meet. He barely saw Noah anymore, and the small apartment began to feel like a prison. The loneliness gnawed at him. Every night, he'd sit at the security desk, staring at the monitors, wondering what had gone wrong. His only escape was his programming. It was the one thing that still made sense. One night, as James was finishing his shift, a man came rushing into the lobby, drenched from the rain. He looked panicked, eyes wide as he approached the desk. "Hey, man, I need your help," the man said, his voice shaky. "Someone's after me." James blinked, confused. "What? Who's after you?" The man glanced behind him, then leaned in closer. I'm not supposed to say this, but I know things. They're trying to silence me. You gotta help me." James, unsure of what to do, motioned for the man to sit down. "Okay, just calm down. Let's figure this out." But before they could say more, two men in suits entered the building. They scanned the room, their eyes locking onto the man sitting in the corner. James felt his pulse quicken as they approached. "We're looking for someone," one of the men said, his voice low. "Have you seen anyone come through here?" James hesitated, glancing between the man in the corner and the two men. He wasn't sure what was going on, but something felt off. His instinct screamed at him to lie, to say he hadn't seen anyone. No one's come through here," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. The men eyed him for a moment before turning and walking out of the building. As soon as they were gone, the man in the corner stood up. "Thank you," he whispered. "You just saved my life." James watched as the man disappeared into the night, his mind reeling. He had no idea what had just happened, but the encounter left him shaken. The next day, James tried to put the strange event behind him. But as the weeks passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He started noticing things, people watching him, strange phone calls in the middle of the night, emails that vanished from his inbox. It was as if the man's paranoia had followed him home. but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had to keep working, keep coding, keep surviving. As time went on, James's life became a delicate balance of working nights and chasing programming gigs during the day. He started building a small reputation online, taking on freelance jobs wherever he could find them. It wasn't much, but it was something. Slowly, he began to feel like he was getting back on track, even if the shadows of that strange night still lingered in the back of his mind. And then, one day, everything changed again. Life continued to grind on for James. He worked long hours at the cafe during the day, serving customers coffee, cleaning tables, and taking orders. It wasn't glamorous work, and the monotony of it wore on him. The constant hustle of customers didn't leave much room for him to think about his programming dreams. He'd pull out his laptop on his break, trying to squeeze in a few lines of code here and there, but more often than not, his shifts left him too drained to focus. One rainy afternoon, while wiping down tables near the cafe window, James noticed an older man in a suit sitting alone at a corner table, sipping his coffee and reading something on his tablet. The man had been there for hours, quietly working away, occasionally glancing up when James passed by. James thought nothing of it until the man approached the counter as James was adjusting the register. The man, tall and gray-haired, with an air of quiet confidence, leaned on the counter and nodded toward the open laptop James had left near the espresso machine. "You a coder?" the man asked, his voice smooth but casual. James blinked, taken off guard. Yeah, sort of," he replied, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "I do some programming when I can, but it's nothing serious right now." The man smiled thoughtfully. "I noticed you working on something earlier. You're more than a barista, I take it." James chuckled nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, I'd like to think so, but it's been hard to find real opportunities. I dropped out of college, so right now I'm just working here to make ends meet." The man nodded, as if he understood completely. "I see. What kind of programming do you do?" "Mostly web development and some back-end stuff," James explained, suddenly feeling self-conscious about his skills. "I do some freelance projects, but nothing big." The man raised an eyebrow. "I work at an IT company, and we're always on the lookout for talented young programmers. We've got a few entry-level positions open. If you're interested, I could set up an interview." James's heart nearly stopped. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. "You're serious?" he asked, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. The man smiled again, sliding a business card across the counter. "Come by the office tomorrow morning, and we'll see what you've got." James stared at the card as the man left the cafe. The card read, "David Monroe, Director of Development, Crestline Technologies." James had heard of Crestline before. It was a mid-sized IT company that specialized in software solutions. His pulse raced as he pocketed the card, wondering if this was finally his big break. The next morning, James dressed in the best clothes he could find, which wasn't saying much. His only blazer was a bit too big, and his shoes were scuffed from his time working at the cafe, but he did his best to look presentable. When he arrived at Crestline Technologies, he was greeted by a receptionist who directed him to a sleek, modern conference room. David Monroe entered a few minutes later, greeting James with the same calm confidence he had shown at the cafe. The interview began, and James's nerves were quickly put to the test. David asked about his past projects, his experience with different coding languages, and how he approached solving problems. James answered each question as best he could, drawing from his freelance work and the personal projects he'd poured his heart into over the years. He didn't hold back about his struggles, dropping out of college, working odd jobs, and coding in his spare time, but he made it clear that programming was his passion. David seemed impressed by his honesty. "We're not looking for someone with a perfect background," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We're looking for someone with drive." "You've got that." James felt a surge of hope. "Does this mean?" David nodded, handing him a contract. "Welcome to Crestline, James. It's entry-level, but you'll have plenty of opportunities to prove yourself." James could hardly contain his excitement as he signed the contract. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for, a real job in the IT field. As he left the building that day, his head was spinning with possibilities. For the first time in a long time, it felt like things were finally falling into place. James threw himself into his new job with everything he had. The learning curve was steep. He was surrounded by developers who had degrees from prestigious universities, and the pressure to keep up was intense. But James wasn't about to let that stop him. He worked late nights, often staying in the office long after everyone else had gone home, studying code, learning new frameworks, and taking on every challenge that came his way. David had taken a particular interest in him, assigning him to some of the more difficult projects early on. One of the first big projects was developing a new feature for one of Crestline's flagship products. The project was complex, with tight deadlines and high expectations. James spent weeks working on it, often skipping meals and sleeping only a few hours a night. But in the end, the feature launched on time, and it was a huge success. As the months passed, James's reputation in the company grew. He became known for his problem-solving skills and his ability to think outside the box. His coworkers began to come to him for advice, and even the more senior developers started to respect him. He was no longer just the guy who dropped out of college. He was a valuable member of the team. But despite his growing success, James never forgot where he had come from. He still spent his free time coding, taking on side projects and experimenting with new technologies. Programming wasn't just his job. It was his passion, and he was always looking for ways to improve. One day, David called James into his office. James had been with Crestline for nearly 2 years by this point, and he had risen through the ranks faster than anyone could have predicted. "James, I've been watching your progress, and I have to say, I'm impressed," David said, leaning back in his chair. "You've come a long way since that day at the cafe." James smiled, still slightly in disbelief that this was his life now. "Thanks, David. I couldn't have done it without your support." David waved a hand dismissively. "You did the work. But now, I think it's time for the next step." James raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I've been working on a new initiative," David explained. "We're developing a cutting-edge platform, and I want you to lead the development team." James's heart skipped a beat. "Me? Lead the team?" David nodded. "You've proven yourself time and time again. You're ready for this." The offer was a dream come true. James accepted without hesitation, and over the next few months, he found himself in a position of leadership for the first time in his career. It was a daunting task, managing a team, coordinating with different departments, and overseeing the development of a platform that could make or break the company's future. But James rose to the challenge. The project was a massive success, and with it came a new level of recognition. James was no longer just an entry-level programmer. He was now a key player at Crestline, with offers coming in from other companies looking to poach him. But James wasn't interested in working for someone else anymore. He had a different vision. After 3 years at Crestline, James decided it was time to take a risk. He had saved enough money, gained enough experience, and built enough connections to start his own company. He left Crestline on good terms, with David's full support, and began working on his own startup. It wasn't easy. The early days of running his own company were some of the hardest he had ever faced. There were nights when he wasn't sure if they'd make payroll, and days when everything seemed to go wrong. But James had learned resilience over the years, and he wasn't about to give up. His startup focused on developing innovative software solutions for small businesses, something James had always been passionate about. He hired a small team of developers, some of whom he had worked with at Crestline, and together they built a product that quickly gained traction in the market. As the company grew, so did James's reputation in the industry. Investors began to take notice, and soon, his startup secured a significant round of funding. With the financial backing, they were able to expand rapidly, and within a few years, James's company became one of the most talked-about startups in the tech world. Looking back, James could hardly believe how far he had come. From a college dropout working as a night security guard to the founder and CEO of a successful tech company. It hadn't been an easy journey, but every setback, every late night, and every challenge had led him to this point. And as he sat in his office, looking out over the city skyline, James couldn't help but think back to that rainy day in the cafe, when a simple conversation with a customer had changed his life forever. "My life had changed in ways I could never have imagined since I left my parents' house, broke into the tech industry, and started my own company." It wasn't just the financial success that defined this transformation. It was the sense of control, power, and independence I had gained. Still, Despite all my accomplishments, one thing kept eating at me: how my parents had tossed me aside all those years ago. I had tried to move on. I really had. I poured myself into work, lost myself in coding, and distracted myself with the thrill of building something from scratch. But deep down, there was always this unresolved anger. It was like a wound that never healed. We hadn't spoken in years. There was no reconciliation, no acknowledgement of what I had achieved. To them, I was still the son who had defied their plans and walked away from the life they had laid out for me. One night, after a long day at the office, I was sitting in my sleek apartment, scrolling through real estate listings, just something I did for fun, keeping an eye on investment opportunities. I didn't expect to stumble across anything meaningful. But then, something familiar flashed on the screen. My parents' house. The home I had grown up in. The place that had been my world before they kicked me out, was for sale. I stared at the listing, feeling my heart race. It was surreal seeing it up there like just another piece of property. All the memories of growing up there flooded back. Family dinners, Christmas mornings, that awful night when everything changed. It was strange to see the house, the very place where they had exiled me, now on the market. Curiosity turned into something else. I looked at the details: who was selling it, how much they were asking. It didn't take long for me to figure out that they were in financial trouble. It made sense. My dad had retired, and his law practice wasn't doing well even before that. They had probably stretched their finances thin, and now they had to sell the house to survive. That's when it hit me. I could buy the house, not just as an investment, but for revenge. The thought of it gave me a strange kind of thrill. After all the pain they'd put me through, I could buy the one thing they had always held over me: stability, security. They threw me out of that house when I needed them most, and now I could own it. The more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. I wasn't going to tell them, though. No, I wanted it to be a surprise. I'd let them keep living there, not knowing that I was their landlord, and when the time was right, I'd reveal the truth. It would be the perfect way to show them how far I had come, and how little I needed them. I didn't waste any time. I contacted the real estate agent, arranged the purchase, and within a week, the deal was done. Just like that, I owned my childhood home, though my parents had no idea. It felt strange, knowing the house was mine now. A house that once represented everything I hated was now a part of my empire. I didn't do anything right away. I let it sit for a while, giving myself time to let the reality sink in. But soon enough, I was ready to make my move. The day came when I finally decided to confront them. I hadn't spoken to my parents in years, but I knew where they were, how they lived, and what their situation was. My father, now in his 60s, had retired, and my mother was working part-time at some boutique. They were still in the house, my house, probably renting it back while trying to figure out their next move. I pulled up to the house in my black car, parking down the street so they wouldn't see me coming. Walking up to the front door, I felt a rush of adrenaline. It looked the same as it had all those years ago. Same bricks, same front porch, same memories. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I rang the doorbell. After a few moments, my mother opened the door. She looked different, older, more tired. Her eyes went wide when she saw me standing there. "James," she whispered, like she wasn't sure it was really me. "What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, my father appeared behind her. His face instantly hardened when he saw me. "You've got some nerve coming here." I didn't flinch. I'd expected that. "We need to talk," I said calmly. "There's nothing to talk about," my father snapped, stepping in front of my mother like he was protecting her from me. I didn't react, just kept my tone steady. "I think you'll want to hear this." There was a long pause. My father glared at me, but eventually, he moved aside and let me in. Walking into that house again after so many years felt surreal. It smelled the same, like old furniture and the faint scent of my mother's perfume. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. I could feel the tension in the air as they led me into the living room. "So, what is this about?" my father asked, arms crossed. His voice was full of anger and suspicion. "You come here to gloat? To rub your success in our faces?" I shook my head, leaning back in my chair. "No, I came here to tell you something important." I paused, making sure they were listening. "I own this house now." Silence. My mother's face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth. My father just stared at me, disbelief flashing across his face before anger took over. "What the hell are you talking about?" he finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "I bought the house," I said, my voice steady. "It was up for sale, so I bought it. Which means, technically, I'm your landlord now." My mother looked like she might collapse. "Why would you do that, James?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I looked them both in the eye. "Because I could. Because you threw me out. You made me feel like I didn't matter. Now, you're the ones who don't matter." My father's fists clenched at his sides. "What do you want?" he growled. "You didn't come here just to tell us that. What's your plan?" I smiled, but it was cold. "I want to triple your rent." The words hit them like a bomb. My mother gasped, tears instantly welling in her eyes. My father's face turned red, his anger boiling over. "You can't do that," he spat. "We can't afford that." I shrugged. "Not my problem. You'll either pay or move out. You gave me 24 hours to leave once. Consider this payback." My mother stood up, her face streaked with tears. "James, please, we're your parents. We raised you. We didn't mean for it to turn out like this." I felt something tug at me. Guilt, maybe, or regret, but I pushed it away. This was what they deserved, wasn't it? They kicked me out when I needed them most, and now it was their turn to feel helpless. But as I looked at my mother's tear-streaked face and my father's slumped shoulders, the satisfaction I thought I'd feel wasn't there. Instead, there was just emptiness. Without saying another word, I stood up and walked out of the house, leaving them in stunned silence. The days that followed were strange. I kept waiting for the thrill of victory to hit me, for the feeling of power and closure to wash over me. But it never did. I continued with my life as usual, meetings, running my company, expanding my business, but there was a nagging emptiness that wouldn't go away. I had done it. I had bought their house, thrown their cruelty back in their faces. But the revenge I had spent years fantasizing about had left me feeling hollow. Late one night, sitting in my office overlooking the city, I found myself thinking about my parents again. I had all the success, all the money, all the power, but none of it had healed the wounds of the past. Buying the house, tripling their rent, making them feel powerless, it hadn't fixed anything. The bitterness, the hurt, it was still there. I realized, sitting there in the quiet of my office, that no amount of money or power could fix what had been broken between us. Owning their house didn't heal the pain. It didn't bring me closure. If anything, it just deepened the divide. Revenge wasn't the answer. It never had been. What I needed wasn't to punish them, but to find peace within myself. It was time to let go of the bitterness, to stop letting the past define me. And as I stared out at the city lights, I knew that the only way forward was to forgive, not just them, but myself.